Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all ready for a great day of school. Well, for today's devotion, we're going to be taking a look at Isaac, specifically Isaac and Rebekah. When you think about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which of those three do you think were named the least in Scripture? Hands up for those who think it was Abraham, that Abraham was named the least in Scripture, the least number of times. All right, hands up for those who think that Isaac is named the least number of times. And finally, hands up for those least number of times. Well, if you raised your hand for Isaac, you were right. Isaac is mentioned the least number of times in the Bible. In fact, less than half the number of times that both Abraham and Jacob come up independently. So what do we conclude from that? Does that mean that Isaac is less important than Abraham and Jacob? Well, I don't think that's the case at all. But what I think that what God is trying to tell us is that the things that are recorded about Isaac's life are things that we need to pay very close attention to. In Galatians 4 and verse 28, we're told that Isaac was a child of promise. And Paul in Galatians tells us that we too can be children of promise if we live in the same way that Isaac lived. So what can we learn from Isaac's life? Well, let's think about the things that were recorded about him and see what it is that we can learn from him. We'll have 3 devotions on Isaac and Rebekah. The first devotion will look at Isaac's life before he ever met Rebekah. We'll see how God was preparing him to be the leader and to be the husband that Rebekah needed him to be. And for that, we'll look at Genesis 22 to see the sacrifice of Isaac. The second devotion will take a look at the selection criteria. What were the things that Isaac was looking for, or rather that Abraham and Eliezer were looking for, in a wife for Isaac? And what can we learn about the selection criteria that we should be using as we pursue relationships in our lives? And finally, we'll look at the element of collaboration. How did Isaac and Rebekah work together? What can we learn from their relationship and how we work together in our relationships? And for that, we'll look at Genesis 27 with the blessing of Jacob and Esau. So let's take a look then at some of the lessons that we can learn from Isaac's preparation. For that, we'll think about Genesis chapter 22, the sacrifice of Isaac. God was preparing Isaac long before he ever met Rebekah. And you can think about this in the context of our own relationships. Long before we can ever be a successful partner for somebody else, we have to be prepared ourselves. And for us, that time of preparation begins in our parents' households. So as you think about yourself, each of you is living in your parents' household. And that is the time that God is using you to prepare you for all the great things that he has in store for you in the future. And so use this time wisely. Think about the time that Isaac had in his parents' house and what he learned. When we come to the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22, one of the primary things that we see about Abraham and Isaac is that they were working together. Father and son were a team. In fact, that word for together, yachad, comes up 3 times, comes up in verse 6, verse 8, and verse 19 to emphasize that Abraham and Isaac were together in everything. Think about your own relationship with your parents. Could you say that in everything, that you're working together? What about when mom and dad ask you to do chores? Is that something that you are of one mind on? Or is there some argumentation that goes on there? Because with Isaac, he was one with his father, not just in doing what his father asked him to do, but he had a willing attitude. There was no reluctance on the part of Isaac. In Genesis 22 and verse 3, we read that Abraham got up early to go to Mount Moriah to do what God had asked him to do. Guess who that means was also getting up early? That's right. Isaac was getting up early with Abraham. But where's the record of Isaac complaining? How about you guys when it's time to wake up for school? Mom and dad come along and it's Time to get ready for school in the morning, and you got to wake up early. Are we complaining when it's time to get up and go? Well, Isaac wasn't. And if we want to be a child of promise, then we need to be learning from what it is that we see in Isaac. You know how long it took to walk to Mount Moriah? We're told that Isaac walked with Abraham for 3 days. How would you guys be feeling after 3 days of walking? Maybe a little complaining about the feet hurting? Are we there yet? Things like that might be coming out of our lips. But not so with Isaac. We don't see any of this resistance coming from Isaac as he was going with his father Abraham. One of the other things that comes out from taking a look at Abraham and Isaac is the words that Abraham says concerning what they were going to do together in verses 5 and 6. He says, I and the lad will go and worship together. That meant that Abraham and Isaac were accustomed to worshiping God together. And that's the same thing that we do with our parents, going to meeting together, going to midweek class together. It's a real testament if we can learn how to worship God together, because that's what's going to draw us together with our parents, to be unified in that purpose. And in this case, that's what brought Abraham and Isaac together, unified in the purpose of making a sacrifice to God. But Isaac must have known, in verses 7 and 8, that he was the sacrifice. Think about the realization and how challenging that would have been. He knew that his father didn't leave things to chance. Abraham was somebody that was way too prepared to do something like that. He brought the wood, he had the knife, he had the fire for the offering, but where was the sacrifice? Abraham told his son, well, don't worry, God will provide himself the lamb. Isaac must have realized that he was going to be the sacrifice. But where was the resistance? The whole time, carrying the wood, building the altar, laying the wood, binding himself or being bound by his father. Where is the resistance that we see from Isaac at this point in time? What about us when we're asked to make a sacrifice by our parents? No, our parents don't ask us to be offered up. But what about when they require just a little bit of effort, a little bit of sacrifice, to do the dishes in the evening, to do the chores? Are we whining? Are we complaining? Are we resisting? Or are we willingly following along with what our parents have asked us to do? Because when Isaac did what his father asked him to do, he was declaring that God was right. Because what God has asked our parents to do is to raise us to help us toward the kingdom. And what he has asked us to do as children is to be obedient to our parents. Because if our parents don't do a good job in raising us, they're going to have to answer to God. And so we want to work with our parents to help prepare for the coming of Jesus. Because if we want to be children of promise, then we need to make sure that we're using the opportunities now that God gives us to really prepare. Well, when it's all said and done, we know that a lamb was provided, that Isaac didn't have to be offered, that even though in Abraham's mind the act of sacrifice was done, that God spared Isaac. And the words that we read in Genesis 22 and verse 19 was that Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. Did you notice that it said that Abraham returned unto the young men? It doesn't say anything about Isaac. Where is he? Well, Abraham and Isaac were so unified that it doesn't even call Isaac out as separate. Father and son working together, walking together toward the kingdom. So each day, young people, think of this as an opportunity to be prepared for the relationships that God has in store for you in the future. When your teacher today asks you to do something in school, do it willingly. Don't just do it begrudgingly, but do it joyfully. Be obedient. Look for opportunities to help. This is the type of young man that Isaac was, and that's what made him a child of promise. not just because he was born to Abraham. Just like because we are born into a certain family doesn't make us children of promise. What makes us children of promise are the decisions that we make each day to show by our behaviors that we want to be in the kingdom. So use today as an opportunity to prepare.